Вітаємо! Гомін України є двомовна програма, на якій ми стараємося показати вам дещо цікавого з українського мистецтва, громадського життя і взагалі української культури. Наша сьогоднішня програма зосереджується на мистецтві української народної вишивки. Welcome to Echoes of Ukraine, a series of bilingual programs highlighting cultural and educational themes as well as personality profiles. Today's program deals with the art of Ukrainian embroidery. From the oldest historical and archaeological materials found, we learn that embroidery has long existed in Ukraine. Fragments of woolen clothing decorated with multicolored embroidery have been found in graves dating from the first centuries of our era. Embroidery is also found on drawings, frescoes, relief carvings, and sculptured figures dating from the 4th to the 11th centuries. Unfortunately, due to the relatively short lifespan of woven cloth and thread, almost no actual examples of folk embroidery have come down to us prior to the 17th century. Most embroideries preserved in museums in Ukraine date from the last several centuries, with those of the 19th century being most numerous. In Ukraine, embroidery, or vishivka, was done almost exclusively by women, and female children were taught to embroider at a very early age. A girl was expected to prepare embroidered articles and clothing to last her entire lifetime, for everyday use, for festivals, for the dowry, the wedding, and ultimately even for her funeral. Any girl who had not mastered the craft of embroidery would not be considered a good catch on the marriage market. Every spare moment was devoted to embroidery. During the long hours of autumn and winter, or during periods of rest from fieldwork in the spring and summer, girls would gather to embroider, sing, and socialize.
Вона мусить дивитися, наприклад, я вам зараз покажу, як вона хоче перетягнути ту, аби вона хотіла ту перетягнути, аби не було таких тих перетягань.
She says that the most important thing is to keep the distance very short on the reverse, where you're bringing the thread over, to keep it as short as possible, and so that you won't have any long threads hanging on the back. Okay, so that's.
А бачите, ще я скажу, як вона хоче перетягнути би ту, то вона мусить піти тим, а не так іти відразу ту.
Я вже їй пояснила.
То все знає, так. То є добре, що друге вона. Аби не було одно від другого аж ту перетягано. Якщо вона перейде так, де найближче є.
So always go for the shortest distance, the closest stitch to the next one to the one that you've just finished, and keep it clean on the other side by not having long threads. А пані Стасю, ви вже, мабуть, довгі роки вишиваєте. Коли ви почали вишивати і хто вас вперше навчив?
Я почала вишивати, як мала 9 років.
She started embroidering when she was 9.
Бо я любила дуже, знаєте, я дуже любила свою вишивку. А мене учили мої мама.
Her mother taught her how to embroider.
Вони мені показали перші ці наші стіби. То найперше я вишивала стіби. Як я вже йшла добре управлена стібами, то вони мені показали, як шити хрестик. Так, як я вам показала перед хвилиною. Як я вже зробила хрестик, я хочу щось більше, щоб то так мене мама поступово учили. А в школі, тому як я вже почала добре вишивати, учителька виділа, що я добре вишиваю, ще більше мене поправила. Я вишив.
Did you embroider for good wear, or did you embroider for every day?
Чи ви вишивали тільки на свято речі, чи ви вишивали так само для щоденного вжитку?
У нас, як на Україні, то дівчата носили все вишивано. Йшли з роботи, вони мали сорочку вишиту, але так лише
clothing, whether you went to the fields to work or to church. Everybody wore
там, де я жила, на Батьківщині, то дівчата мали, до роботи як йшла, то виставки вишиті, обшивка така малесенька була, тут, знаєте, вишита.
Although there are close to 100 various techniques used in Ukrainian embroidery, they all fall into two basic categories, solid stitches and open work stitches. Unfortunately, due to the nature of our program, we will be able to present you with only a few of these embroidery techniques. Today, cross-stitch embroidery, vishuvka chrestikom, is the most widely used Ukrainian embroidery technique, not only in Canada, but in Ukraine as well. Plain cross-stitch consists of two slanting stitches, one placed over the other and crossing in the center. If the material allows for the counting of threads, the stitches can be worked directly onto it. If, however, it is too closely woven, it is covered with an auxiliary canvas over which the design is worked. When the work is finished, the canvas is drawn out, thread by thread. To ensure the neatness of cross-stitch, the needle should always enter and leave the material at the same points as in the previous journey. Cross-stitch, which had been used in Europe since the end of the 18th century, first appeared in Ukraine at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. The importation of this new technique, and there are sources who claim that the cross-stitch came to Ukraine via China, brought about profound changes in Ukrainian embroidery. Due to the ease of execution, it quickly became very popular and in many areas squeezed out more traditional and difficult techniques. At the same time, inexpensive albums of embroidery patterns intended for the cross-stitch technique became widely available in Ukraine. Most of these patterns consisted largely of floral motifs in a naturalistic interpretation, and this resulted in a change in the style of Ukrainian embroidered ornamentation. The popularity of such floral motifs is still much in evidence today, particularly on Ukrainian female dance shirts. Cross-stitch embroidery is so prevalent and established among the Ukrainians that even now many people are of the opinion that the cross-stitch method of embroidery is a purely Ukrainian manner of needlework. The oldest technique of Ukrainian embroidery is the niz, or nizya, nizinka, or zanizuvanya, as it is also called. It is believed that at one point it was the most widespread and perhaps even the only known embroidery technique used throughout Ukraine. Working in one color, usually in black, the embroiderer works on the reverse side of the cloth, advancing thread by thread in a progressive pattern from right to left, and thus laying down the design in thin rows called zamochki in Ukrainian. The threads which are thus covered are always odd in number, 1, 3, 5, and do not form an outline, but rather constitute the essential design itself. Once the entire background design is laid down in this needle weaving stitch, the colored details are then added on the right or positive side of the fabric. Niz embroidery can be employed only with severely geometric motifs which are formed by the crossing and breaking of lines. Theoretically, this technique is simple, but in practice, the woman who has not done it since childhood will find it difficult to accomplish proficiently. In Ukraine, niz embroidery in its various forms is widespread in Podillia, Polissya, Volyn, and the Carpathians. Unfortunately, this difficult technique is seldom used by Ukrainians in Canada. Stebnivka, as it is called in Podillia, is a simple stitch that is widely used in Ukraine, where it is also called vystib in Kiev and shtapivka in Poltava. The technique is similar to a basic running line stitch, but is worked as a two-sided line stitch or simple back stitch. Working from right to left, the thread is brought through on the stitch line and a small backward stitch is made through the fabric. The needle is then again brought up through the fabric, a little in front of the first stitch, and another backward stitch is made, pushing the needle in at the point where it first came through. In Ukrainian embroidery, stebnivka is used on its own to create light feathery designs, or more frequently is used in combination with other embroidery stitches, where it acts as an outline delineating various areas of color. Embroidery has always been directly involved with the creative expression of the mode of life of the people, their manners, traditions, and clothing. In the beginning, the decoration of cloth with embroidery was inspired by the faith in the power of protective symbols, much the same as the decoration of Easter eggs, but eventually this gave way to purely aesthetic motives. The art of Ukrainian embroidery was so widespread and beloved that it was practiced in practically every village and household. Gradually, depending on geographic conditions, availability of materials, and the effects of various influences, there evolved several fairly large ethnographic regions, each with their own peculiarities expressed in their embroidery through various patterns, colors, and techniques. Even within these ethnographically distinct regions, however, great variations are found between each province, district, and occasionally even between individual villages. Ukrainian openwork stitches can be divided into three main categories: mereshka, openwork, in which the threads are drawn crosswise only; stягування, drawn work, done by drawing the lengthwise and crosswise threads into squares or circular designs; and вирізування, eyelet work, in which designs are overcast and then the eyelets are cut out. These stitches are often combined with лиштва and числена гладь types of counted satin stitch to create embroideries of great richness and subtlety. Among the bright and colorful embroideries of Ukraine, those of Poltava stand out as unique and unusual. Poltava was famous for its monochromatic white-on-white or subtly hued embroideries done in a variety of openwork and solid stitches. The preparation of thread for white-on-white embroidery was a very time-consuming and tedious task, as the threads had to be bleached, whitened, and salted before they could be used. This type of embroidery is thought to resemble frost patterns made on window panes. In an old Ukrainian folk song, a girl sings of embroidering a shirt for her salt-trading lover. По білому білим шила, інеєм рубила, сороченьку чумаченьку, що вірно любила. Although white-on-white openwork embroidery originated in Poltava, it can also be found in the embroideries of Вінниччина, Прикарпаття, and Чернігівщина. This is due to the close cultural ties that existed between all but the most isolated areas of Ukraine. Some scholars believe that white-on-white embroidery predates embroideries that utilize colors. The original embroidery thread was the same homespun linen thread used in weaving the cloth. To make it more durable, it was coated with wax or soot and thus became yellow or gray. When black was required, woolen threads would be used. The art of thread dyeing was discovered at a later date, with tree bark, roots, leaves, flowers, and fruits of many plants being used to produce a broad spectrum of colors and shades. After dyeing, the threads were baked in rye dough, thus becoming color permanent for decades. Factory-made threads dyed with chemical aniline dyes became widely available in Ukraine during the second half of the 19th century and radically changed the coloration of Ukrainian embroideries. The factory-made colors lacked the softness, the pastel qualities, and the harmony of the colors from plants. As a result, newer Ukrainian embroideries, particularly those from Western Ukraine, are brighter, more colorful, and less subtle than their earlier counterparts. A house without a rushnik is not a home, says an old Ukrainian proverb. And indeed, in the past, rarely could a Ukrainian home be found which did not contain embroidered towels called rushniki. As its name implies, the rushnikovy show, or towel stitch, is a two-sided stitch primarily used to embroider rushniki, although it was also used to decorate other household articles in central Ukraine. Prior to commencing an embroidery, a stylized floral design is drawn onto the cloth from a prepared design transfer. The basic areas are then outlined with a type of stem stitch which gives a raised contour to each design element. The smaller areas thus formed are then filled in with a variety of rushnik stitches in various techniques. Towels, woven of the finest threads and decorated with intricate embroideries, have been produced in Ukraine for centuries and have had a myriad of uses. Depending on their function, towels had names. Utirac, for wiping hands and faces, stirka, for wiping dishes, bojnik, for decorating religious icons, plechevy, for matchmakers, podarunkovi, for gift-giving. Embroidered towels played a central ritual role in marking the important events of life, sending loved ones away on a long journey, beginning new building construction, greeting important guests, and in housewarming. In the Ukrainian wedding, rushniki play an active and central role. They are worn by the svati, matchmakers, during the engagement ceremonies. They are placed under the feet of the bride in church and are used to tie the hands of the couple as a symbol of the marriage bond. Designs of the rushniki, and this applies as well to other types of Ukrainian embroidery, were primarily geometric, floral, or geometrized plants and animals. The layout of the design, the selection of embroidery technique, ornamental motifs, and color scheme used depended primarily on the region of Ukraine where the towel was made. Despite great freedom in selecting designs for rushniki, most women who made them strictly followed long-established traditions. Rushniki were produced in great numbers, and numerous examples have survived. The Chernihiv Regional Museum alone has over 7,000 embroidered towels in its collection. Among the most beautiful embroidered towels are those of Poltava and Kiev, with their floral designs in the form of a flowering tree, symbolizing the tree of life, or a vase with branches, flowers, and occasionally birds, embroidered exclusively in red thread. Embroidery has long been one of Ukraine's top popular arts and handicrafts. In fact, no other field of Ukrainian folk creativity is so rich in the diversity of techniques employed, the variety of color schemes and compositions, and the assortment of ornamental motifs. We will probably never know when or who first thought of the idea of expressing in colored threads the beauty of the surrounding landscape, the experiences of life, and the range of human emotions. The Ukrainian embroidery tradition has long satisfied our functional, ritual, and aesthetic needs. It has been passed down through the centuries, generation to generation, mother to daughter. It is an inseparable part of the Ukrainian cultural heritage and is still relevant in our lives today.